Hallo, schönen guten Abend. Herzlich willkommen zu unserem Dienstag um 6 Vortrag. Wir haben heute einen Gast aus Amsterdam. Das ist Peter Wingender von dem Büro Winhov. Da freuen wir uns ganz sehr. Das ist ein Vertreter, wo ich sagen würde, der passt sehr, sehr gut zu unserem Thema. Architektur im Zeitalter des Neoliberalismus, Architecture in the Age of Neoliberalism und Rationalism. Also es geht um Rationalismus, Rationalism. Peter will speak in English, so maybe I switch to English. But he understands German, as he told me. So if you want to ask later then questions in German, that's no problem. But rationalism is a topic we try to follow this semester, where I think your work is really very much fitting. Maybe some introduction words about the office and Jan-Peter. Jan-Peter has studied at the TU Eindhoven. So you have in the Netherlands, you have two main universities, that's Delft and Eindhoven. And Delft is more conceptual and Eindhoven is, I would say, more craftsmanship, more about detailing, more about the merging between architecture and technical questions. And he then studied at the Berlage Institute in Amsterdam. He was between 2003 and 2007 the director of the architecture department of the Academie van Bouwkunst in Amsterdam. That's another type of education in the Netherlands. And he was also lecturer at the Amsterdam Art School. And maybe the core issue for his life is, of course, the office he founded together with Joost Hovenier in 1995 until today. So it's now nearly 30 years. Next year, your office is 30 years old. Young. And he founded this with Joost Hovenier, who unfortunately died in 2016, but he has some two younger partners, Uri Gilad and Inez, and the office has now about 30 people. So your office is mainly working in brick. I think brick architecture is one of the core things you work on. You have made several publications also, Brick and Exacting Material, a book in 2016. And 2023, very important step, I think, you won the Architect of the Year award in the Netherlands, which is a very remarkable award. So he's a member of the BNA board. He's supervisor also for urban projects, like in the Amsterdam Pampusbuurt in Eiburg, or Zuidas block at the Zuidas in Amsterdam. So he's not doing only architecture, but also urbanism. Yes, that's maybe about you. The projects we will see, I hope, are quite mixed. So you started mainly also a bit more in the housing, mixed urban projects, but meanwhile you have done quite a series of public projects also, like the Royal Academy of Sciences, Stadthaus Leiden, for instance, National Holocaust Museum, and more, of course. And you're also in the world of transformations, restorations, which is also now an important field of work, I think, for your office, with Amsterdam Amstel train station, where we were second. So
it's a small world.
For us, it was a sad
it's a
thing.
Very small world.
Yes, it's a small world indeed. And he's not only working in the Netherlands, but you also work in Switzerland, and you work also now in Belgium, in Flanders. So you broaden also your view. There is, I found some quotes on your website, which just stuck with me somehow. That's love for buildings, love for craft. That maybe circumscribes quite well what you're busy with. So please welcome Jan-Peter, and we are looking forward to your lecture.
I will.
Does he need the microphone?
Like that. Yeah, that works. Good.
Okay.
If I'm too not loud enough, then let me know. Thank you, Andre, for inviting me. It's really nice to speak about work and to reflect on work. And I was kind of a little bit triggered with the title that you gave me, Rationalism in the 21st Century. I thought like, oh, wow, now I need to think. So, and what it started with was kind of perhaps a little bit going back to my journey into the profession, the way I was educated, how that kind of shaped my thoughts. And then from there on, how those things develop. So as Andre told me, I was educated second half of the 80s in the University of Technology in Eindhoven, which was had a very small architecture department. But I really liked the school because it was really a kind of classical polytechnic, and with a lot of, let's say, learning in construction and building physics, and also an attitude in that school where design was very much connected to the idea of making. So this notion of design by the thinking of the making was something which was always very close to me, which I think came really as a core in the way that I started to work in architecture. And from a kind of incredible joy in thinking about how things are being made, constructed, to then how are they organized, what do they mean as an object? What is it? How can you use it towards, let's say, what does it mean in a city, urban planning, all these kind of things. So this notion of rationalism, for me, the kind of logic of thinking through materials and construction, is something that is very close to me. It's very often the way I approach a project. So, yeah, I'll speak about that. And the other with rationalism, of course, is kind of when working on buildings, you start to think about city, you start to think about places, and this, let's say, this other notion of rationalism, which is not kind of connected so much with the logic, but let's say the work of Rossi and all the rationalists, if you like, throughout time, really profoundly influenced my thinking. It's a kind of level of thinking and a structural way of thinking, typology, materials, that I very much enjoyed. I try to twine that a little bit through the lecture, rationalism. So some years ago, 10, time flies, there was a kind of issue by The Architect, which is like the national magazine in the Netherlands. And it was done on 4 young architects or emerging architects. And it was called the Reds, the Rationalists. So we were kind of, although the practices of these 4 architects are quite distinguished and different, we also share a lot of conversations and a lot of debates. And very often we work on similar projects, and like on Amstel Station, we end up in the same competitions, or we end up also on this stage, because I think already one of them was here. So it's kind of interesting, this kind of you're coined as a rationalist, although I never very much considered myself as such, but it's kind of interesting. So that rationalism has been quite with me for a long time. But you have to imagine, we started that office in 95. And these are the days of Super Dutch. That's like the thing going on, you know. And in 2000, you get this book, Super Dutch, which kind of, you know, established like the image of Dutch architecture. Internationally, but also nationally. It was like you know, that was the thing. Also, clients would come to you like, what's your concept? And I was really like, oh shit, I need a concept, you know. You have a program for me, or you have a site, so I can start working. And it very much kind of, it irritated me really strongly. This focus on concept, and then I would ask my architecture friends that were very much involved in this kind of thing. And then how do you make a building? Oh yeah, then we have a concept, and then we materialize the concept. And I thought like, oh shit, I completely work a different way around. I think about a material and I start to conceptualize that material, you know. So for me, that was like going into practice and establishing an office in that climate very much shaped, and was also like a mirror back to me, to my own thinking, my own preoccupations. And a few years later, there was this very nice book called Supernormal, The Sensations of the Ordinary. And for me, that was like a cornerstone where I thought like, oh yeah, That's much more where I am. You know, it's just sitting in your office and observing a whole pile of Dieter Ramsch books. That's pretty close to this kind of thinking. And that supernormal book has a predecessor. I think you know it, because I think Bason Brock also lectured with you here. Yeah, and he wrote the introduction to that book. Das gewöhnliche Design. That's 50 years old now, that book, that exhibition. That's like, you know, I sometimes feel old, but that's like before me. But it's really, I found that really super interesting. And in the introduction of that book, he writes this small sentence that analyze and understand your contemporary everyday world as the everyday world of a historical society. So kind of this distancing from the assignment where you are, reflecting on what is the meaning of the assignment, what do we do here, towards how do you build it, you know, and also this notion on time, which is in this sentence, you know, it's building a building is like doing something quite permanent. Most of the structures we make are intended to stay for, you know, 50 years, 100 years. If you do them well, they stay longer. So this notion on the everyday normality of our profession has always been very close to me. And as André said, brick was an important material. And I'll show one project in brick very briefly to also notify a little bit this kind of rooting in this rationalism, perhaps a bit more in the Rossian way. This was one of the first bigger assignments we got, and it was finished in 2006. So that's a building that's almost there for 20 years. And it's in the docklands of Amsterdam. That's, you know, when we were starting, the transformation of the Eastern Harbor site was like in full progress. So a lot of work for young architects was within that framework of the harbor development in Amsterdam. And I absolutely adored and loved the site. I knew it, growing partly up in Amsterdam. And there were this kind of warehouses, you know, concrete construction, brick facade, De Zwijger, the silent one. And then with these names of, you know, the places that we would trade with. And as young architects, there were 3 offices that we also more or less grew up as a generation through these projects. We were asked to work on 6 towers, 2 buildings along the water, on a double-story parking garage. And to understand it, we had this small model on our table, and we were asked to do the 2 outer small blocks. 10-story high, or 11, social housing. And I go not too much into the plan, but we were very fascinated with how you could construct a brickwork facade, how you could think through what does it mean to make a warehouse, actually. You know, it wasn't so much a housing project for us. The idea was more to build a contemporary warehouse, a kind of very neutral structure with a very neutral facade, where the living room could be the same expression as a sleeping room, could be the same expression as a loggia, could be the same expression as a kitchen, because it would change over time. The whole design concept was that of a kind of open plan construction that you could change. And for us, kind of echoing on this idea of a 2-story plinth and then changing the structure of the building on the 5th floor so it would resonate with the harbor buildings along the water was of interest. So we built those 2 towers, and you see a brickwork facade, and a very practical one is a horizontal concrete band that projects a little bit out. The outward projection is quite simply for fire safety reasons, so that the fire from one floor cannot go to the other floor, so that we could do this kind of floor-to-ceiling openings that you could open, so that at least you could look out over the city. And originally we proposed to the city we do 2 exact the same buildings, because I couldn't think of a reason to do 2 different buildings. So that really caused us into a huge debate with the city and the supervisors, because the buildings had to be different. So in the end, we settled on the fact that one has like a single door and the other one is a double door, and the one is in brown brick and the other one was in red brick. The rest is like exactly the same. And I really like them as twins. They're literally these urban figures in the city. So it speaks about the logic of construction. It speaks about the use of material. And of course, it speaks about where you build, where you are. And this, let's say, I think rationalism, if you like, was pretty much there for us as a way of working, both in its logic, in its practicality, in its no-nonsense character, but also as a sensitivity to a place, an idea of type. These kind of things really stuck to us quite early on. So I thought I continue then on concrete and not on bricks this time. So we do a lot of bricks. I still love to work with the material, but we did a whole series of concrete buildings. And it's for the very same reason, the material I'm very fascinated with. We are working on a whole series of towers, or this kind of mid-high rise, 70 meters, which is like the new urban standard in the Netherlands. And I like to show them to you as how we work on also that projects start to influence one another. So they become like a series, you know, it's the one individual object, but you invent something, you take that with you into a next project. So one of the joys of an office is not so much the singular projects, but it's this kind of line that you build up, this knowledge that jumps from one to the other, this kind of small discoveries that you make, that you take along. We were asked this journey more or less started when we were asked in Switzerland with our partner Zeno Vogel to work on a high-rise building, Zölli, in Zurich West, where actually the plan and the structure was designed by Miley Peter Architekten, good friends of ours, and their facade was rejected. The office was a little bit in crisis. No, it was not a little bit. It was very much in crisis at a certain moment, and they asked us, please help us to design that facade. And what, you know, we went to meet the client, we walked out of that meeting, and there was a kind of advertisement on the wall in the street selling the apartments we still had to design the facade for. So, you know, 3 months, load-bearing, prefabricated facade in concrete. Think, work. So we build a model of the thing to understand it, to also understand how, let's say, this kind of, you see a split level on the heads of the building and a kind of normal running floors in it. So also in terms of typology, there was this kind of theme of 3 floors that were always combined that we started to play with, and a structure and how you could make it. And we developed at a certain moment an idea of L-shaped elements that you could stack. The core was kind of in situ concrete sliding up, and then they would stack these elements around, and then they would pour a floor on top of it, and then they would do the next one, the next one, the next one. So there was a kind of construction logic already decided before we came to the table. So for us, this whole question was, do we now like a big element with a window in it? And we decided to develop it in terms of L shapes, which of course resolves problems with joints, defines the window, defines the loggia, and has a certain logic and repetition to it. And we thought, oh, it's going to be very repetitive, you know, very easy. And then you make this drawing with all the different types that you get in the facade, and it always looks easy. So the story is like, no, we do everything the same. And then, of course, in the end of the day, each one is different. You know, you get a repetition over 3 floors, and then the next one, which in the end was okay, because you can do a certain maximum amount of elements from a cast. So anyway, they would build different casts, you know. So this is the kind of logic that you learn. It doesn't need to be repetitive all the way, because then they just make more casts of the same type. So they can also easily make more casts of a different type. So it's this logic that we learned there. And that facade worked like that. And it was a super efficient building site, which is kind of very interesting, you know. It was 2 cranes and a kind of scaffolding that would go up and down. And the building would just kind of rise up. So no scaffolding around, extremely efficient, short time of building, which is, of course, with these type of buildings, very, very important. You know, speed of construction in a tower is what defines the price of the whole thing. You know, the slower it is, the more expensive it is. Not about material use. It's really the rationale of building and of construction. So this is the facade, with a kind of small changing in the direction of the piers. You read these 3 floors in the rhythm. The rest is very repetitive, very, if you like, rational in that sense. And it really fitted also the site where we were building. So it stands in Zurich West. It's part of 3 towers. So on the left, there's Roger Diener, one of my, you know, big heroes. Is kind of also extremely nice to work with architects that you absolutely admire, that have been very constitutional to my thinking. And all of a sudden you start to work together. It's really like, oh, wow. And the other one by Mike Guyer, the office tower. Well, it really fits this kind of tough climate of the railway tracks in Zurich. And so that journey of thinking through construction was very nice. And there was a tender for a competition for student housing in the University of Eindhoven campus, where I graduated. So that was like my going back to the school. And it was the first student housing on the campus. And also same question, speed of construction, prefabrication, please, can you think of something? So with that knowledge of Zölli, we started to develop the design for this one. And it turned out that here kind of floor to ceiling elements were like the most efficient. So almost like Plattenbau, you know. And then of course, there is this idea of how is a window going to sit in there? How do you proportion these kind of elements? And of course, the endless game of how do you resolve the joints between those elements? You know, are the joints kind of determining the image of the architecture, or is it a game or is it a play that goes on? So very logic. And of course, the kind of cool thing about prefabrication is that you go to a factory, you know, building sites and crafts is super cool to work with. I really enjoy building sites, but perhaps I even enjoy more factories. You know, this kind of making a load-bearing facade, developing that with the guys in the factory is a joy. And sometimes you discover things that you don't design. And it's this kind of design by the thinking of the making. So we were at the factory, and the guys were showing us around what they could do. And then the kind of the man that kind of was ahead of the finishing department of the factory, he said, "Oh, I have such a cool machine. I have a polishing machine. You know, you can put it down and it goes around, you know, and turns my concrete into terrazzo." And we were like, "Oh, that's super cool." And the client was immediately, "Oh, no, we cannot afford that." And we were like, "Well, what if with these ribs we put the element on the back and we just let the polishing machine run over the outer edge of the ribs?" And the guy was so happy with his machine, he says, like, "We do that within the price." That was really on the site in the factory decided. You know, it's not like a design, it's not like an endless research. It's a conversation in a factory that kind of defined all of a sudden a game with a finish, you know? And I enjoy these things. That's kind of design by thinking of the making, or talking about the making, or kind of discussing with the people that actually make your buildings. They're not scary, they're humans, they enjoy their life. And yes, you have to talk about football sometimes and have a beer, but it's really, they're very cool people. So the whole plan was extremely rational, if you like. There's a load-bearing facade corridor in the middle, course with bathrooms, all prefabricated, and we built that building within 12 months. So within 1 year, that building site went up, down the kind of infill that you get with them. And the only thing we did is we shifted the system a little bit, because the proportion of the building that we were getting to was quite boring, I would say. And in Eindhoven University, the buildings have a kind of more, sometimes slender proportion, and this kind of games with shifted cores goes on. So for us, that was like a theme to play with. That kind of really arrived from the typology of the campus. So I think there were, at the peak, there were 25 people working on the building site. It was like the cleanest building site I ever had, you know. It's just like people would come, kind of plug in things and done. Everything prefabricated, the facade. Also, what you see there's the bathroom going in. So very fast, very efficient, but a very nice way to build a building. So very repetitive type. And of course, what you see is that, you know, these small jumps with a kind of horizontal beam that kind of define a rhythm, that they define that you start to count the floors. They give a scale, and they give a certain richness to the image. There's also this kind of idea of a tectonic expression with kind of vertical and horizontal elements and infill. But the reality, of course, is this, it's one element, but it's a fantastic way to hide joints also. So it's kind of thinking through those things. And then this slender head of the building on the campus. This was really speed of construction. That kind of developed into this last one in this series that I show, social housing, small studios, 30 square meter. That's a lot of them being built in Amsterdam at the moment. I don't like them particularly. And when they came to us to design them, I thought like, oh, do I want to do this? Because usually you end up with a 3 meter wide or 4 meter wide room, 9 meters deep with a small window. And you know, you have to climb over the bed in order to get to the window. And there's from a typological point of view, I really hate them. So when they asked us to work on it, we told them, we love to work on it, but then we do a wide house. So we orientated not kind of in a narrow direction, which of course is kind of by economy and sustainability the easiest way to do it. But we said to the client, if you want to have these studios, then you want to live in a kind of wide orientation towards the facade, so that you can order a sleeping room and a living room and a kitchen next to each other along the facade, rather than having one after the other before you get to the facade. They accepted that, and in order to do that, we had to prefabricate that building, because also here, this was again 70-meter towers. Speed of construction is everything. You can do this when you build very fast. So we designed a core, a very efficient one with a double corridor, and then these houses to it, and then even the houses on the west had to have a balcony to it, part of the prefabricated system. So it was really like the next step to work on it. It's in the post-war area in Amsterdam, which has a kind of tradition of concrete buildings, which is the modern city of Amsterdam, the modern part. And also here again, you know, working with the guys from the factory, you know, making a mock-up, testing it, and finding out also here that I had a polishing machine. So this building was prefabricated. It went up with 1 floor a week, 27 floors. So, you know, it took them half a year to make the basement and get to the first floor, and then the second half year, the whole thing went up extremely fast. Balconies included into the prefabricated system. So, kind of interestingly enough, they balance in the element itself. They sit in it. They hang on it. But it's a cool thing that you get like a small apartment with your own outside space. And we were discussing with them, what can we polish? And then, since you look at all these balconies at the underside, we thought like, oh, then we polish just the balcony, you know, the ceiling of the balcony. So they polished all our balconies up to a kind of terrazzo quality. So it's very interesting. If you stand, you know, in your small studio, you look out, you have this balcony above you, but it has to shine. It's a kind of shiny, you know, brings in the light, and it gives an incredible refinement just to this world of concrete, you know. There it is. It's finished now, so the cranes are gone, and people start to move in. January 1st, they get the keys to their apartments, and I find that very fascinating. It's also a type of building that really fits this kind of post-war area. It's not trying to be sentimental about that part of the city. I really enjoy that part of the city, and I think buildings like that also fit that part of the history of the city. I will show buildings later on that have a completely different urban setting, that demand a different answer. But in this case, it really is part of that site. And of course, kind of plays with proportioning a building, reacting to horizons in the area, a small homage to Auguste Perret here and there, and then you have a fantastic building. But I think it's not what I would like to lecture about tonight. The question is 21st century. So rationalism in the 21st century. You know, what is now the 21st century? What's it going to be? I am 30 years in practice. I have some years to go, I hope. But you guys, this is your problem. Eh? This is what you are going to be confronted with. This is your working area. This question of what's going to happen in the 21st century. And I think if there is one big thing that's going to define Western European architecture in the 21st century, is the fact that we are going to stop to demolish buildings. You know, just from sustainability point of view, this whole idea that a well-constructed object, that you take it down, doesn't make sense anymore. There's so much embodied carbon, there's so much embodied grey energy in those structures that working with existing buildings and not demolishing them anymore, I think is going to be really the big question for architectural practices in the 21st century. The past 150 years, we built technically quite okay buildings, sometimes a bit of a problem here and it needs some insulation and stuff, but basically they're sound constructions. I think we cannot afford anymore to take them down. So this 21st century question to me is not a question about new construction. You know, that super Dutch, that was all about new construction. You know, architecture was new construction. And I think the big shift that we're looking at is that architecture is going to be, how do we deal with existing buildings? What is going to be our strategy? How do we work with them? And also their rationalism, type, material, building technique, all these kind of things, they work. We witnessed a shift the past 10 years in our practice. So more than half of the projects that we have in our team are reuse projects, steadily growing. We do less and less and less of new constructions. And when we do them, I really enjoy them. So it's not about, you know, being ashamed of making a new building. It absolutely makes sense. Well, it makes sense for good reasons. You have to think of the reason why you make a new building. So the whole kind of order of thinking is kind of reversing. You know, you have to almost make an argument why you demolish a building. 10 years ago, there was like no problem. You just demolish a building. So the shift in the thinking in our clients, in the government, among architects is really, it's very impressive in the past 10 years. And it's happening at the moment as we speak. And I think for you, it's going to be, as young architects, it's going to be like half of you is going to work on these kind of things. So there's like a, you know, there's a set of images from existing buildings that we're working on currently or just finished. And it's a whole range, you know, that comes from very old buildings. I think the oldest objects we are working on are from 800 BC, Pascal, so from the year 800. You know, these are the oldest buildings we are working up until buildings that were, you know, 1978. You know, so this whole range, you get the whole history of architecture, you get on your plate. No worries, you get all type of different urban situations on your plate. You know, this is what you're going to work on. And I thought I'd just bring you a few projects that how we deal with them. So what's the, let's say, our approach, the method, the way we want to work on them, and try to reflect a little bit also on the approach that we're slowly developing in them. And the first one is an extension of a former university building. It's a building in the middle, up there. And it's on the edge of Oosterpark, which is one of these kind of classical urban parks, English landscape design, as you can see, with a big pond. And on the edge of it, which is on the former rampage of the city of Amsterdam, they built all these kind of classical institutions. So there was like the museum on the big building on the left. That was the Tropical Museum. So there was a colonial museum, basically. And then next to it, our building was the anatomic laboratory building of the University of Amsterdam. So that's basically where surgeons were learning how to slice up bodies. That's, you know, that's the kind of thing you do. You don't want to have people there. You put it somewhere on the side of the park, and it was this kind of very classical, late 19th century, beginning 20th century university buildings. You have an enormous amount of those type of buildings in the city. So for us, that was very interesting to work on. Our client was allowed to turn it into a hotel. One of the last ones in Amsterdam. There's a ban on hotels in Amsterdam. You're not allowed to build hotels anymore in the city. And that's really done in order to reduce tourism in the city. And they were allowed to build it under the circumstances that you see the park here, and these parks have become increasingly important in the city. They're really very intensely used. And all these buildings were fenced off from the park. So basically you still see the road going around. And beyond that road, there was like, you know, was private ground. So the park really had like a backside to it. And the assignment for us was bring the park around the building. So no fences, no nothing. You can, from the park, you can walk towards the building and develop a hotel in that. And hotels, we did one before and are very interesting programs, but also very demanding programs. And of course, also here the question is, how do you deal with an existing building? How do you densify that existing building? Because all these reuse projects, it's always about densification. You know, it's always more surface, more program, more this, more that, you know. So you really have to think through how you can do that. So this was the first day when we went there. And one of the lovely things, of course, about working on existing buildings is you can go there. There is a building. So you don't need to think, you know. You know, cut the concept, there's a building. And you know, get to know the building, get to know its history, its architect, why it sits the way it sits, what's the typology here. It's these kind of things, and just observe the building as it stands there. It was empty already for 10 years. University went out, and still there were traces of the original use, and it was used by artists for a long time. There were kind of funny installations on the right-hand side to the building. It's like a machine. They had this kind of teaching room in the middle, strange object. And going in, there were parts in the building where you could still sense the original use, but also kind of the rest of it completely stripped. And some parts where you know, where the original quality of that building was still very much alive. Some corridors with a kind of chalk stone and glazed bricks in them, kind of classical university building, and a kind of exhibition room on the top, where they used to have like the preparats on what you call that, strong water. So funny animals, funny shaped people. This was like, you know, this was like the little horror show up there. It was a public room. You could go there. Very funny. Can't think of it. But for us, it was kind of interesting to think through how that building was originally designed. It was a kind of classical U-shaped building with a corridor in the middle and research and teaching rooms to the left and to the right, and then this kind of central educational space. You know, rooms like this, centered around a corpse, and then, you know, you would be educated there. And then already during construction, the Brain Institute had to be added to this type. So they already designed, during construction, they made this funny wing sticking out. So this is the way we found it. So it was already extended during first step in its life. And the building permit that was originally issued for the building allowed for the building to be built between here and here. So basically close off the middle court and change the typology of the building from this kind of open U shape towards the park to a kind of closed inner court type. And we thought that was really a stupid idea. For the very simple reason that if you do that, then all the rooms which are in the back are not connected to the park anymore. And the whole idea was build a building in the park. So what we proposed was, don't build the building there, but put it there. So build an extension to the extension. Point. We won the competition just with those diagrams. So it's a kind of typological thinking related to park, to the urban setting, to programs that kind of gave us the solution. And this is what we handed in as a proposal. It was a small model. It's big like that, because you need to keep it in your hands. You know, these are private investors, clients, so you need to explain your project over champagne and coffees and stuff like that, which means you bring a very small model or you bring a really big model, but anything in between doesn't work. So we chose the very small one that we could take just in a bag and just, you know, we have a whatever, and then we could put the model on the table and explain them, this is what we're going to do. And the interesting thing is they could lift the model, go around with their eyes, and just by the fact they could hold that model, they could control the idea. And the interesting thing is the client just looked at the model and told us, like, it's a good idea, we do. So it was like straightforward commission. So very generous, extremely generous clients. They bought the building, they developed it, they run the hotel. So it was all in one hand, which is important. And of course, the joy in brickwork also here was, how do you extend such a building? You know, how do you play with this kind of slightly decorative late 19th century brick architecture, and how can you build a contemporary extension to it? Hotel rooms, basically. And how do you proportion that building? You know, basically it was a 2-story building with a pitched roof and a kind of half basement situation. And then in order, densification, that's like 6 stories next to it. So how do you proportion a building that still talks to the original building? But also, there's an incredible amount of program that comes to it. You need to add a parking garage, you need a back of the house, you need a preparation kitchen. There are 2 restaurants in this building. There's 100 hotel rooms in it. So what we did is we said, okay, we build you that parking garage and that completely back of the house underground, and the park can run on top of that towards the building. The other thing that we do is that we lower the building by 70 centimeters so that this becomes like a full floor. So basically on the park, this is ground floor, but on the street side you go up and this is your first. So you have like 2 first floors. And of course the attics, but that's a no-brainer that you use them. So interestingly enough, we tripled the amount of usable surface of that building. That's kind of economic thinking to it, which is very, very important. I mean, to work on existing buildings, that's a high level of investment. So also there, a building site is it's pretty complicated. It's a big one. And we always think we don't do so much to the building. And in reality, in the end, this building was on jacks for a while, because we had to lower the basement, which means that all columns needed to stand on a jack, and we took away all the ground floor and the foundation, lowered the whole thing, and then built the columns under the existing columns, which is pretty intensive, which is being a lot on the building site as well. In the Netherlands, there's a lot of complaints that architects are not attached to the building site anymore, and that construction industry is very remote from architectural thinking, these kind of things. If you work on existing buildings, you spend at least as a project architect or as a project leader 2, 3, 4 days a week on the building site, because there's all kind of shit problems that you didn't think of when you were designing the whole thing. And what I really enjoy about those situations is you need to improvise. The whole building industry in itself is orientated towards the exclusion of risk. You make a BIM model to exclude all kind of risks, and you have risk management, and everything is about costs and risk. But with an existing building, you basically don't know. You know it until you start to build it. And what I really like about these building sites, you need to improvise. Within an idea, you need to improvise. So as an architect, you need to be very flexible. Improvisation in architecture is not like a common thing. But funny enough, for example, in music and in theater play, improvisation is like the peak performance in the profession. And in architecture, we tend to stay away from it. But the interesting thing is, if you work on existing buildings, you need to improvise, and you need to develop that capacity to be flexible in your thinking and quick and fast. So the park was extended around the building. Like I said, very, very gracious clients that kind of, said, okay, we do the whole park. You stand there, you won't see anything, and they did so. So there's the entrance of the parking garage. The ramp is within the landscape itself. The landscape goes around, and actually the blue line is the private property line of these people. And they just gave the entire property back to the city, so you can walk around. It's restorations, which is very interesting to do, because you really get to work with absolutely building experts. People that really love their craft and their profession. That's really something lovely about working on existing buildings. It's also a different type of contractor that you get. And it's not better or worse than the guys that do my prefabricated concrete elements, but it's basically the exact same conversation. How do you do it? What do you do? How can we support, or how can we organize it in a way that you can do it the best way? Which was very interesting. And for example, in these corridors, there was no electricity or sockets available, and we didn't want to touch the walls. But we had to do a fireproofing on the very small steel profiles that hold the brick vaults. So the only thing we did is we extended that a little bit, and all the installations are within those small steel profiles on the ceiling. So it's a kind of also, sometimes you're a bit between a detective and an architect, when you design these kind of things. So the theater of horror turns into a Michelin star restaurant. That's all part of the game. Funny enough, on the outside, we just restored it. We brought it back to its stage, and kind of very interestingly enough, when we started, the building was not listed or whatever, and when we finished the whole project, they listed it as a monument. that's kind of, world is full of paradoxes there. But it's interesting to do. So the park goes around. The extension stands to the extension. There's like a conversation with it in terms of proportion and materials. And of course, it's fantastic to do a brick facade. I really love bricks because they have this capacity, the whole design of that facade was based on 5 bricks, but with funny shapes. So that we could like do funny corners or, a projecting brick. And of course, you don't want to have a joint exactly in the corner because that's like the weakest point of the whole construction. So we had all these kind of shaped bricks. And then, of course, you design that entire facade brick by brick and you color it. Each brick has an own color, and we go on the building site and we have to explain the mason, this brick goes here, this brick goes there. For the first 2 weeks, they go crazy. And then after that, they really started to love it, and it was like a fantastic to work with the guys. And it was really a joy to explore, the possibilities of expression in brick again, in a way, in a very decorative fashion, if you like, really as a cladding, as a dress around the main construction. It also has no constructive meaning to it except to hold up itself. Well, I really love these kind of, chamfered corner situations resolved with those funny bricks. The joy of patterns. Really also the rich texture. The basic tone of brown of that brick is exactly the same as to the existing building, but just by the firing process, you get all these nuances in the brick, color nuances, which kind of distinguish it. You can see it as a new building, but it's also very much related to that existing building. And this is how it stands today in the park. Interestingly enough, the brasserie on the ground floor that you see opens up to the park now is like an address to the park. It's not for the people that stay in the hotel. Yes, they can go there for breakfast and they can have drinks there and have a dining. But also when I'm in the park, I can go there and have a drink. And so the building has really become part of the park. It's like an address in the park. It's not just an obstacle. So that renovation is not only giving a life to the building, it's giving a life to the park. It's kind of giving something back to the city here as well. What it taught me somehow, these projects, is how do you approach working on these existing buildings, And what I, during the course of these projects, started to define as myself as, if you like, an analog approach. And the word analog is chosen purposely because after Rossi left the ETH, he educated a whole generation of architects that the analogen on the ETH. There's this whole series of Swiss architects that were educated in a kind of, many of them by Rossi and his crew, and then established this kind of analog thinking, which was about type, which was about material, which was about the atmosphere of the city, the place where we are. And interestingly enough, their buildings were not about contrast. They were about continuing to build upon the city, which is, of course, interesting if it gets to working on existing buildings. Because many of the debates that I have with heritage, with clients, it feeds back to those 4 A4 sheets, which is like the Charter of Venice, which describes how we should deal with existing monumental buildings, with heritage. The whole heritage approach is based on those. I thought it was going to be a hell to read it. It's funny enough, it's 16 articles. You read it through, and the whole history of, the whole approach, if you like, of working on existing buildings is described in it. And of course, it was done in those days for very good reason, because a lot of heritage, a lot of excavation sites, a lot of these things were under threat. So they really had to define some very strong rules. But it was also a very modern approach, or modernist approach, if you like. So, of course, it was about historic substance. Funny enough, the word space is not mentioned in the document. Type is not mentioned in the document. It's just about material. It's about securing the historic material. That's the essence of it. So, in a way, it's a completely non-architectural statement, but a lot of the architectural thinking and debates are based upon this document. Strange. everything that you do has to be reversible. Well, the building I just showed you, and it's anything but reversible what we did. We lifted that entire building, you know. How do you reverse that? A useful purpose, okay, I agree on that, but that useful purpose is about densification. You know, reuse is about densifying the building. And then this fourth one, this idea that there needs to be an identifiable difference between old and new. Of course, the modernists were very clear about that. You have a brick building and then you have steel and glass. That's easy. That fitted the program of the modernists. So that, you know, that in itself established a kind of tradition almost in dealing with those buildings. But with some of those buildings, we always felt slightly uncomfortable with it. I really like this identifiable part, but it's not about old against new. I'm not interested in that. I'm very interested in how one evolves into the other. And of course, this approach is only one of many. And there's a really nice book, Die Architektonische Konzepten der Rekonstruktion. I can say that here. Normally in my lecture, everybody's looking at, oh, that's German, I don't understand that. But you can read the book. It's really worthwhile to read that book. It's a small, it comes in this Bauwelt series, small booklets. And Alexander Stoom makes this kind of, and this is then in Dutch, because I had to explain my Dutch people that there are different approaches, you know. There's this kind of historic approach based on many of the works of Viollet Leduc, and then there's this kind of interpreting approach, which is very close to this analog approach, you know. Dolgast, Scarpa, these kind of, you know, that tradition in architecture is very much there. Then there is the archaeological approach. That's very much this kind of Venice Charter. It's basically an archaeological description of architecture. Ritual approach, which is like the Ise temples, that they're rebuilt every 20 years. The conceptual approach, there it gets kind of contemporary, if you like. There's the critical approach, that's, you know, Stiemann and the kind of, but relates, I think, much more to a kind of urbanistic tradition. And there's like the historical simulation. That's the one I really like, because, for example, the Barcelona pavilion is kind of a completely rebuild of the original pavilion. So it's like a simulation. It's not a historic building, what we're looking at these days. And very often you see like this combination. So yeah, Neues Museum Berlin is an elegant mix of various approaches. But it's nice, the book really takes it. And what I like is that this archaeological approach is kind of, you know, counterparted with, there are different approaches, there's different ways of handling existing buildings. And of course, these kind of things have been very constitutional for me in my thinking. You know, visiting Munich, have a look at Dolgast, have a look at the work of Josef Wiedemann, who, you know, they did fantastic work. It's unbelievable what they did to these existing buildings. But it's also people like Gunnar Asplund, you know, it's a different approach. And that's things that I really liked. And I ran upon an article that was written by Martin Beusch a few years ago in Werkbouwen en Wonen. And he defined more or less that analog approach just in 5 simple rules. So the first one is the identity of the existing building is to be strengthened. So this whole idea of what is now an identity of a building. An identity is built up of a lot of components, you know. An identity is stacking up in itself not unique elements to a kind of unique mix. That's what makes an identity. And then it gets very architectural, which I like, you know. For every question, there is an answer to be found within the catalog of elements and the rules that determine the existing building. So as an architect, you have to analyze. You have to become that detective in order to understand what the architect before you did. You have to understand him, because if you don't understand him, you cannot operate. Then if point 2 does not provide the answer, it is to be developed out of the internal architectural logic of the existing building. So then you get more into a kind of interpretive stage of how you deal with it. And of course, there's always exceptions. Nothing fits the rules. And there you really, you know, you have arguments and you need to think of sometimes a weird solution, which kind of, you know, might be fighting with this logic idea of rationalism, but within a set of rules makes sense. And of course, avoiding these cliches is a little bit like a nod to, you know, the steel and glass answer to historic buildings. And then I really love the last one. may doubt be your trusted companion because you don't know. There's no given rule. So you really need to reinvent the design process over and over and over again. We were very much helped by this when we were working on this building. This is the City Hall in Leiden. It's an old building. It was a kind of conglomerate of existing buildings, and then in the 16th century, the Flemish architect Lieven de Key built the longest Renaissance facade in front of those existing buildings, uniting them to a city hall. So this was the facade of that building, and up to the day of today, it's the longest standing Renaissance facade in the Netherlands. Shows on paintings, and behind that facade, the city hall more or less was a conglomerate of buildings that kind of extended, added. Behind this facade it was a mess, but the facade stood. Until 1929 in February, when one of those buildings caught fire and the whole building block behind the facade burned down. It was really cold, so they could secure the facade. And they kept the facade. So interestingly enough, there was a competition where an architect was invited to design a city hall behind an existing Renaissance facade. And how do you do that? And Blau, the architect, did that. So above you have like this historic situation with the grown place, and this was the assignment he got. There's a facade and there's an empty plot. Do me a town hall. So all the architects in the Netherlands of the day were working on that competition. Dudok made he basically projected the town hall in Hilversum. He projected behind his Renaissance facade for free. He said he went to the mayor. He said, I made you this beautiful design. There's like very funny letters of that. Then they turned it into a competition, and Blau eventually won it. And to understand what he did, he was a really good architect, but also very, on the one hand, Beaux-Arts classical school architect, but this is 1930, so it's also contemporary construction going on. So the way that he handled the building, he says, I project the classical Beaux-Arts town hall behind that facade, which is like the model with two courts. You get that all over Europe, especially in France. I think every second building has that type, you get it? Tower in the middle behind the main entrance. So that's the diagram on top. And the first thing that he does, which is down, he slices up the building and he creates a court that faces the city. And then he organizes around a corridor and an inner court. And these two courts kind of, this is the quiet one, this is the loud one, this is the one orientated to the city, this is this kind of the one that gives daylight and a certain orientation for the building on the inside. He kind of accompanied the original entrance with a second one on the square, and since the original building was on a dike, this entrance is 1 story lower than the street, and this entrance is 1 story higher than the street. So there's a 2-floor difference between both entrances. So this very simple typological scheme, if you start to think it in 3D, becomes complex. Then he up there shifts the tower to the square. He makes an entrance building and he slices up the building in order to have like houses that kind of talk to the size of the historic tissue of the city surrounding it. These are small houses, so he couldn't do like a big building in it. And then he organizes it in a way that all the public programs go in this shape, facing the street and the court, and kind of all the offices are in the other space. So we really had to analyze that building to that level in order to understand it, to understand what he was doing. So here it is, clad in bricks in a kind of traditionalist design. It was kind of pretty much provocative to do it that way. And really, it's a cladding on the outside. It's like a fairy tale to the outside, because this is the construction of the building. It's a straightforward concrete construction. They're completely modern, had the installations in it, everything. But then on the outside, it's kind of, It's a really fascinating building. And then on the inside, he cladded the whole construction again. So on the outside, it's all bricks and, very nice, romantic, traditionalist Dutch city thinking. And in the inside, you're in Italy all of a sudden. This is like, there's an enormous amount of different types of marble being used in that building. It's built in the middle of the crisis, 1930s. This building was being built. But the city was so proud, and they really wanted to have like the most beautiful town hall. So this is like the Burgerzaal, so the gathering room, the public room, so to say, and in the back you have the wedding room. And as you can imagine, it's like one of the most popular wedding places, in the Netherlands. If you want to really have your classical wedding, this is where you go. Very interesting. And interestingly enough, on the outside, it doesn't talk so much about tectonics, it's not really making an expression of the rational structure, but on the inside, actually, the cladding and the lining really is kind of simulating this structure of beams and columns, and that builds up the building. So usually what we should expect on the outside is very much present on the inside here. The building was not finished by Blau, but was finished by Zwier, his successor, who really worked in a different vocabulary, funny enough. So all of a sudden, the main council room, which was finished after the Second World War, goes back again into a much different tradition. So we are, entering a building. We have a 16th century Renaissance facade. We have a modern concrete construction. We have a traditionalist brick outside. We have a marble, very rational, but also very classical inside. And then again, there's another architect going on. So as an architect, when we were entering this competition, we think like, we are the fourth one in row now to work on that building. We're the fourth one, that gets handed over this building. And what do you do? What's your position then as an architect? Well, one thing, concept doesn't help. So I really like this image because it's a light coming through the stained glass, 16th century stained glass, entering a room designed by Zwier, looking into a room that was designed by Blau. So in one image, the complete layering of that building. Rich on the inside, but also badly treated in terms of typology. You have a corridor, so what do you put in the end of the corridor in the 1970s? A elevator, It's really, how stupid can you be? And then you have a beautiful inner court, and what do? You cover it in glass in the 1990s. And since nothing grows in there and it's too warm and the acoustics are horrible, you just put plastic plants in it, so it looks like a court. So this is how we found the building. It's really like, oh. So in the competition, we proposed, take the original scheme of Blau and take the typology of that building seriously. Play on the contrast between a public court and a green inner court. Play on this idea that you have your main council room on the second floor, and the main meeting spaces, build it under it in the same wing. Have your entrance really as a kind of public foyer entering and relating to the garden. So all the changes that we needed to do were based on that typological analysis of the building. That was the guiding line of the whole transformation of the building. And interestingly enough, you start to work on different spots. It's not like one project. Yes, of course, the installations are like one project. But the architectural interventions are here and there and there, and this we just keep. And, you're all over the place. But in order to keep it together and to define, like, what is it what we are doing, material and material expression become, like, very, very important. And sometimes it's really about restoration, which is fantastic to do. So this is the room of the mayor. We all restored that. There is a fantastic Escher, the graphic artist, in wood. There's these kind of inlays from Escher, again visible made in the rooms. So really like refined restoration work. Sometimes it's also about adding new elements. This was like a beautiful office with a kind of wooden lining, carpet in it. But then you see it on the ceiling. We had to hang in kind of cooling and lighting elements and heating, So modern technology fitted into such rooms. It's really precision work to do it. And sometimes you also really take away things to open up the building again, you know, to make like a really generous entrance to the building. So here you see that concrete construction standing. We didn't want to clad it in marble because that made no sense, but we developed a set of materials that we wanted to work with. I mean, plaster was of course obviously one, but then plaster, can you proportion a plaster wall, you know? Small questions. Of course, we couldn't use the marble that Blau used, so we thought of, okay, then we use terrazzo as a kind of aggregate version of the marble, and we play with the same patterns that he played with as a kind of tectonic expression of that building. So you use a set of contemporary materials to resonate with the original design. Open up the garden again, having to look outside. Take away the roof, restore the facades. The terrazzo was really like a project in the project. You know, there was Anna Tabalini, she was Italian, she worked for half a year just, you know, drawing those floors, getting the right samples, you know, having the colors to match on all these kind of things, fitting in the electricity parts, but also resolving like the expansion joints that you need in this type of floor. So really, really a work within the work, and it was really fascinating to do. And still, I mean, I still enjoy very much looking at her drawings of those floors. You see them. So, for example, there was like no cafeteria or place where people could have lunch. So we needed to incorporate that again into the building with terrazzo floors. Restoring many of the floors, restoring that corridor with the elevator. So we moved the elevator somewhere else. So the original window was again visible in the end of the elevator, but also, you know, working together with a graphic designer to do all the kind of wayfinding and signing in such a building. You know, it really gets to the details in precision with this type of project. Fitting in stairs, new emergency stairs, and then using the terrazzo also. If you cut through a marble wall, you know, you need something to finish that. And then kind of answering the proportioning of the marble elements just by small lines within the plus. It's the cheapest detail I did. It's just a plastic profile, you know. Well, you get a fantastic interior with it. And it really worked. You know, it really took a resonating, if you like, analog approach to it. And of course you get like problems where you have like 3/4 of the column finished and the last quarter to be done. Opening up that structure on the roof, you know, taking out floors. You will see one of those later again. And there we just left the whole thing visible, you know, barren, so that you could really see that concrete construction for one time, you know, not being finished, not being cladded, just bare and visible. On the outside, we did a lot, but not visible. The only thing we did is we built a small extension where the elevator was in, so they didn't have to stand in the end of the corridor, which was again like a brickwork project within the project. So we just built another kind of one of those bays that was defining the original building. We built it to have the elevator in. I continue with another city hall, which is a completely different type of project, but I like to illustrate a little bit how this way of working goes. Am I good in time still, or 2 more projects to go? This one and another one, yeah? Okay. Let me know. This is Den Helder, which is like in the north of Amsterdam. Napoleon called it the Gibraltar of the North, and he went to visit it. So Napoleon went up there, and he says, "We're going to build 3 fortresses and a harbor in here," which turned it into a naval city. That's like, you know, one visit by the emperor, and that's the history of the town. The town is like these small stripes up there, and the rest is kind of, you know, all fortifications. And all those fortifications were mainly because he needed a secure place as a shipyard, as a dockyard, easily accessible from the sea to go out. And the Dutch Navy used that shipyard ever since, up until halfway the 90s when they left the place. And this was a shipyard in full use. So it's a central dock, and there's this kind of dry dock sticking out, and there's this whole ring of, you know, brick and historic buildings surrounding it, and then this, let's say, towards the water, it's all sheds and workspaces. And Halfway the 1990s, the Navy leaves the place, the city takes over, starts to bring restaurants in it, a theater to it, and then at a certain point decided we are going to build our new town hall on the shipyard. Because the history of this place is so much intertwined with the naval history, even the kind of municipality itself thought like, then we're going to be just there, So we're not going to sit in the city center, which is adjacent to it, we're going to sit there, which I think was a very brave decision. So when we came to the site, it was kind of very fascinating because it is partly still in use as a shipyard. Mainly to maintain historic ships. So this is his dry dock, and the city of Amsterdam is in the dry dock there being repaired. So it's in use. It's very practical, it has containers on it and all kind of things going on. And the buildings that you find are these types, It's post-war buildings, simple concrete construction, brick infill, uninsulated, but stands on a fantastic position in the middle of the shipyard. Things being maintained there. Chrome 6 painted, which is like asbestos, but then in paint shape. So they didn't know. Otherwise, they would have destroyed the building if they knew before. But we designed it as a reuse of this very modest structure, highlight in it. And the other structure, which was along the water, was called the Masten loads, where they would, like the masts would be built in there. So it's basically very long, elongated halls. And when the masts were out, they would used to store torpedoes in here. So it used to be the torpedo shed for some years. But a wonderful wooden construction standing there. This was a first-grade listed monument, this building, because of that wooden construction. Uninsulated walls, very little light, and make me a town hall. That was like the commission to it. So we proposed them a situation where we said like the sheds. That's a one-story building. We put all the public programs in there. So we keep you this kind of street running in the middle of the building from one side to the other side. We put some offices to this side with the kind of public desks behind it. We put your council room in the middle, meeting spaces around, cafeteria, wedding room, main meeting room. That's it. That's the program of it. And then in the other building, that's like a working building. It's the office building for the municipal organization. Interestingly enough, that shipyard used to be a place where people would walk from one building to the other, They had to get around. And by now, all those buildings are closed because one is a theater and the other is a restaurant and the third is an office. And what we really enjoyed was this idea that people would start to walk from one building to the other again, this kind of charging up the public space. So the definition of that building for us was its construction. We said it's like, that defines the type. That's the quality of the thing. But this is also what the building was, just a naked concrete skeleton with no insulation, with no infrastructure in it. And then, of course, it had to become like an office building. So this is like the big assignment with all these type of buildings. This is like, that's the amount of installation that you have to bring into such a building. I mean, it looks like a medical scheme at some point, but it's the air handling of the building. And we didn't want to have that to the ceiling because there were all these kind of beautiful beams. So we put it on the floor and we just raised all the floor 60 centimeters, which forced us to take out the facades. But it gave us the opportunity to leave that concrete construction completely visible as the kind of identity of the building. It had a very simple scheme, offices to the outside, then a ring of, staircases, toilets, lockers, and then in the middle, a void space that kind of leaves the construction visible but connects the floors, which was very important for the municipal organization. And we had to clean it because there was chrome 3 on the paint on it, so we really had to carefully, it's very strange because it's a very modest concrete construction, but it was like almost restored with taking the paint off and stuff like that. But they decided to keep it, so they took it very seriously. We cut out some beams and we just left that construction visible and built that really as an interior inside of it, which kind of provides a very, very beautiful working space for the municipal organization. And then as they go outside, then of course you have like this fantastic views from the offices over the deck, over the docks. Then to the facade, of course, we had to take out the brick facade, an uninsulated glass facade. So we decided to design a new facade within that concrete frame. And for us, that was like, it was clear it had to be a metal facade. It was a shipyard. I mean, there were metal working spaces there. So this whole idea that you could change the infill and really play it on a metal world was very interesting. But you see, I mean, it looked like a regular grid, but you know, get that, and then you get that, and then you get that, and that is different. So each element was kind of tailor-made. Because also the whole construction, of course, was not like that. It was like that. Yeah, yeah. So it looks simple, but there's an enormous amount of work to make it look simple. As for the big shed, the question was a completely different one. Also from its typological point of view, also because this was really a listed heritage building, so we could do way less on it. We had a facade in brickwork where salt and moist was a big problem, so we could not insulate the facade. Also because the wooden beams then would have stand within the insulation line and would have started to rot. So, you know, basically we were forced to leave the facade of that building uninsulated and open, which means we insulated the roof a little bit and we insulated the floor. But given the proportion of the building, the influence of those facades to the overall thermal performance of the building is relatively small. So overall, we got a fantastic energy label for this building with uninsulated facades. And it's kind of organizing it, but difficult enough, you have to build walls within this kind of open structure. You know, it's this fantastic open hall, and then all of a sudden, you know, you have to make like small rooms into it. How do you do that? There was one small building in the building, you know, that's where the supervisor would sit. There, you know, there it was warm, and you can imagine the stories. But what I really enjoyed was this kind of wood and color and lining and proportioning of it. And we thought like, okay, that's then the theme that we can elaborate on when we need to build into this, you know. So we measured the wooden structure, which of course was like everywhere. And then we built a facade system or a wall system in which we incorporated all the installations. So all the air handling, the acoustics, the electricity, they all come from the walls. So the floors we kept open, the ceilings we kept open, everything is in the wall. So it's basically, it's a wall design. And then playing with the proportions comparable to the existing building. What we really enjoyed was the fact that you could look from one room into the other and still experience the depth of that building. So you look into the council room from that main entrance road. We worked together with Jan O'Haan, who designed the letters and the kind of metal, you know, signing, raadzaal, council room. And interestingly enough, keep open that structure, because it tells stories. All the people that worked on the shipyard, when they would leave the shipyard, they were allowed to write their name on the beam with chalk, which means you cannot clean the beams, you cannot do anything to them, because you would literally take away all the names and the history. So the whole project was also about preserving those beams and preserving that construction, not only because of its material value, but also of all those stories. You know, people that live in the city, they go there, they stand in this hall and they say, your grandfather, that's his name over there. You know, it's this combination. As a town hall, I really like that, you know. And it's building in small things, reception desk, werkcafé, you know, leaving that magnificent structure just, you know, it does the job. You don't need to do much. Council room, different color, you know, kind of course, playing with this kind of maritime tradition, the kind of very dark blue. A wedding room with a kind of uninsulated brickwork facade, in a kind of more warmer color. But all within the same system of walls, seating in it, heating in it, electricity in it, everything in the wall. Meeting rooms. Here we didn't touch the ceilings because this was the one part where a bomb fell and they temporarily kind of fixed the ceiling, and we really enjoyed it. You know, it was like a patchwork of different types of wood on top of it, and we thought like, okay, therefore once we don't put any insulation, we just leave it as it is. So here it stands, 2 buildings on a shipyard, reuse, really kind of in a very, both also completely different buildings, although one assignment. So you really need to be, very flexible. I have to speed up. Okay. The Borgismore and the Gypsy Girl, something in between. Because I think those two statues tell a little bit what I am fascinated with existing buildings. We used to have like the argument of cultural heritage in order to keep a building. By now that is being replaced by a sustainability argument. We don't destroy buildings anymore because of sustainability reasons. And with that, we get the whole history of places and all the kind of things that are embedded within that building as part of our project. And I came across these two statues in a beautiful exhibition, Recycling Beauty, at the Prada Foundation, I think 3 years ago. And it tells the story of two statues that were made by Nicolas Gautier. This is Baroque statues. By the time people being very interested in the kind of Oriental mystery, if you like. So the Moors and the Gypsy girls were all over the place by the time. It's very colorful, very kind of with a lot of gesture. So the story goes that they were assigned by Borghese. And the story of them, although they were made separately, they were in the same room, and the story and poem was written about those where the boy would ask the girl to dance and she would kind of decline it with a small hand gesture. So there's like a poem to these two statues, and as it goes with this kind of unfulfilled love story, they were separated. So she remained in the Villa Borghese and he moved to the Louvre with Napoleon, where he now lives. And for the exhibition, they were brought together. And they were analyzed for the first time. And that analyze brought something very, very spectacular. Because Gautier didn't make new statues. He recycled old statues within his new statue. So this part is 150 years after Christ. So 1500 years later being recycled into a new statue. So Gautier really used all his capacity as a sculptor to collect all these historic antiquities and build up a completely new thing out of that. So it's like, you create something new of your time by using existing elements. And that kind of, the idea of continuity that's in it, I really like. The idea of a certain freedom, I really like. And also the fact that it's not nostalgic to those elements. It's really, you use those elements to make something new. So you use an existing building to build a new building. And the new building incorporates the existing building, but it, in fact, is a new building. And I think there really this difference with, the kind of archaeological approach of the charters really starts. Last one, I go quick. Materiality, craftsmanship, rationality. This is Zurich. Bahnhofstrasse is probably one of the most expensive shopping streets in Europe for sure. And I think also, globally they do a good job there. And Mr. Bucherer, who owns a jewelry line, watchmaker, since early 19th century, had a shop there. Kind of Gründerzeit house. With a kind of an erker on the corner, because there's a small knick in the street profile, so that the erker really looks nicely into the profile of the street. And then 1960s, of course, the thing had to be modernized, so away goes the building, and there comes a... Oh shit, and I forgot the name of the architect. That's really a nuisance. Okay, that will come. He designs a 6-story marble building with golden window frames and a kind of dark natural stone plinth. And of course that kind of is covered with kind of advertisements and stuff like that. And we were asked to enter a competition after the previous design by other architects was declined by the city with the question, you cannot take down this building. You need to leave the construction, you need to leave the staircase house, you can do a new facade, But those things have to remain. And the reason why they had to remain is that if they would do a new building, they could do only a 5-story building and not anymore a 6-story building. So they would use a loose surface. And the other thing is that on the Bahnhofstrasse, you're only allowed to have 2 advertisement signs on your building. And if you do a restoration, you can keep all your rights of the advertisement. And they're so freaking valuable that kind of paid for a very, very, very expensive transformation of an existing building. The other given thing is the facade needs to be in white marble. Point. So it's a very interesting assignment, not? So this is what it looked when we started out. A little bit less advertisement on it in the meantime, but still, as for Bahnhofstrasse standards, pretty much. Bucher really on top of it. I mean, the first thing the guy told us, like, you can do everything, but I want my letters back on the roof, you know? So like, no question. He's the biggest Rolex retailer in the world. So it's just to give you an idea of what goes on there. And we were very interested in this idea of marble. And of course, you know, that's like our returning hero. And with marble and kind of combining it with metal, there's of course a tradition in marble in kind of plates and tiles. But if you go to a Bernini statue, that same marble, that very same material almost becomes like flesh. And metal, you know, if you look at the bronzes of Giacometti, it's you know, it's soft, has curves to it, you know. So we were very interested in this kind of the crafts of these materials, also knowing that our client is a jewelry maker and he makes watches, so he's very sensitive to these kind of things. And the other thing we were very interested in is this, you know, this is luxury, you know, this building is about luxury, point. So what's the most luxurious thing on the world? By now it's time. And the kind of passing of time was like this idea, we don't put like a clock on the facade, but the facade needs to show, you know, this passing of the time. So we wanted to really play with relief and the expression of that. Flop, you know, you see the staircase, you see the toilet, you see 3 elevators, a really small building. It's 600 square meters, just a complete project. And so we restored the staircase house. We gave him his shops. Interestingly enough, he didn't want any window in the shop because the idea that people could look into your shop and see other people buying very expensive watches, they didn't want that. But they had some offices on the top floor. So within that same system, we needed to bring in windows. So it was really about closing, actually making a closed box. At the same time, opening it up because there's people working in it. So defining that facade system. And playing, of course, with the buildings around, with the proportioning of the buildings around, answering again this place in the street, bringing back that idea of this ARC bay window in the knick of the street. So actually recycling part of the 1960s buildings, but also taking parts of the building that was previously there as a type. And then I think we sold actually the competition with this scheme, where we explained to the client, your building is about time, but it's about the passing of the time, you know. It's like this very soft shadows on a facade in which you measure time. It was a very elegant steel construction with a very thin concrete floors. Absolutely not, I say this, airbaden safe, which you need to do in Switzerland by now. So we really had to reinforce on the outside with a kind of steel frame. Then we put 4 centimeters of vacuumized insulation, and we put 12 centimeters of marble in front of it. So usually we do like 12 centimeters of insulation and 4 centimeters marble. The whole project was about reversing that, and the whole project was about prefabrication as well, but then on a very high level. One of those advantages that you can, with these type of clients, you can endlessly make mock-ups and play with them, but the big adventure was this, you know, really go to the sources of materials. We went with the client to the mine, and he chose the blocks that he wanted. So he was really like, I want that, I want that, I want that, I want that. Okay. No. So he bought his marble. Then we sliced it up in 12 centimeter thick plates, and then we sliced them and we had them CNC'd in order to have like this very gentle curves in the facade that would kind of catch time. But then, of course, you get like into really 3-dimensional marble designing, which is completely fascinating. And the interesting thing is the marble behaves like wood. It moves, it shrinks. So expansion joints are super important in marble facades, we learned. So it's really this game, it's three-dimensional joint design. That's basically what this facade was about. All CNC'd. The counterpart of it, we didn't want to do a dark natural stone plinth below that marble building. So we went to the client and said, like, we think metal, bronze. And it was really a super client. He says, like, then we go to the art foundry in St. Gallen, which is like, basically that's the art foundry where all big artworks in bronze and metal are being made. That's it. I never thought that I could quit architecture, but when I visited that foundry, I thought, like, I could live here. That's really like, there's super craftsmen working on fantastic metal pieces. So we developed a slightly gently curved facade, and they made like the wooden molds of it. The elements were so big that they couldn't pour them in Europe, so they had to be made in Shanghai, where they have like a bigger foundry. These are vacuumized sand casts. So you basically can open it up like a book. There's a plastic in it. You put the wooden parts in it. You close it. You vacuumize the whole thing. You open it. You close it again, and you pour the metal into it, and it burns the plastic sheet away. And you have like a perfectly three-dimensional bronze element of 15 mil thick. That's super craftsmanship out there. And then that's one goose, that's what you get out of one pour. So it's complete three-dimensional. Different types of finishing, different types of polishing, marble facade on top, very soft bronze. Also the frames around the vitrine are all within bronze, so it's just a different finishing of that material. And it really stands again like an object on Bahnhofstrasse, with the two bays, looking into the street and looking into Kuttelgasse, where the picture is taken from. So in the back there is a Bahnhofstrasse. And again, this building on Bahnhofstrasse, three-dimensional, very, sometimes a window, sometimes not. That was the projects. So one last very quick thing, which is about another problem that comes with it. And I would like to address it with you guys because it's going to be important. All of those discussions on heritage are about originality. Very often that you get asked, what is now the original building? It's the same problem with the statues, And you're obliged to respect the original. But what now is an original? When I was in the art foundry, where we were making the metal elements, there was this young horse, dead-born young horse. But it was made of wax, and it was on one of the working benches to be prepared for casting in metal. And I found out it was an art piece by Berlinde de Buykere, who makes very kind of strong and almost violent art about death. And, and this piece called Honte was about this dead young horse. But this was the plaster cast, so the wax cast on the table. And in order to make that statue, she must have had access to a real dead foal. And probably she would have cast the dead foal in a silicon mold in order to make this. So you have a dead horse, you get rid of the dead horse. So you have a silicon mold, and you have to do this wax within the silicon mold. But when you open that, you destroy the silicon mold. So that's like the second time you destroy the only physical original that you have in order to get to a statue. And then, of course, she had to put that into chamotten, which is like these clay objects. And then by drying the chamotten, the wax melts away from it. So you have a hollow space left. So the third original is also gone before you get to a statue. And then, you put in the metal into the elements, such a chamotten is in here. It's all kind of kept together because if it goes too fast, the whole thing explodes and you lose everything. So it's really like high-end craft. And then you need to, with a sledgehammer, take away the chamotten. So that's the fourth time that you destroy the only available original that you have, in order to end up with a dead foal as a piece of art. So this whole problem of originality in the thinking, I really like to look at it because it's such a different way of looking at things. You know, in order to get to original, you might have to destroy 4 times what is actually original. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring lecture. So
a bit long, I'm afraid, but
no, it was very good. It was very good. I think it's just super inspiring because we are all dealing with the subject of transformation, renovation. There's a special wish from the students, and so forth. It was very good that you addressed this as a statement also in the beginning. And what I especially appreciated was that you showed very different types of projects from very different types of ages in terms of projects to be transformed, renovated, and it showed exactly the difficulties that you have. You have each time a completely new subject, each time completely new building techniques to work with, and in the end, an approach or a concept, if you can call it like this, to develop out of this existing substance. And that's really interesting. Yeah, nearly like a lexicon of approaches to show what it's all about. So I think for the students who are dealing now with transformation projects, that was quite, very, very good overview about the things to be done. So we always have a small discussion still, we can start with some questions, and maybe one starting from my side about your view on continuity of architecture. I mean, we have like 2 different views on history of architecture, and you started with the Super Dutch, and that was, of course, very much the view on architectural history in terms of breaks. And that's very much embedded also in the modernist thinking. So the whole modernism was about it's a break, it's a new age, and so on and so on. And you were confronted with that you were irritated by that. And I think it has a lot to do with, how you look on, in the end, on history and on development as well. And also how you look on progress and innovation in the end. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, because Oliver and me, we always discussed it in the office also, you know. We found out early that we are looking on history more on a continuous way, on an evolutionary and not a revolutionary way. But nevertheless, you also have this big break of modernism, which introduced, this idea of a new concept, a new concept, a new concept. So maybe you can say something about that, how you look on these things.
I mean, that's what irritated me about the Super Dutch, you know, which is like the pinnacle. It's probably like this last pinnacle in modernism, as a meaningful pinnacle, I would also say, you know. But it lives from the idea of contrast. It exists by this idea of contrast, by the notion of contrast, and I think we are going to be confronted with an enormous amount of buildings that we have to deal with as architects. And these are buildings from 18th century, 19th century, 20th centuries. These are buildings with a kind of classical brickwork facade up to a kind of concrete building, up to we're first doing the first, how you say, vliesgevels in English?
Curtain wall.
Curtain wall, curtain wall buildings we're working on now, you know. So the interesting thing is that when you start to work in this field, you get confronted with the whole history of architecture. You know, there's no such thing anymore as, oh, I prefer that, or I think that's better, or I'm more interested in that. You have to deal with all of them, which kind of stretches you as an architect. And I really like that. I really like that. Also understanding that for us, you know, material thinking, typological thinking is very much a key to deal with all of them. Also understanding that sometimes I also recognize that personal architectural preferences work better with one building better than the other one. You know, it's also, I had a discussion with Kees Kaan about that a little while ago, because they did a fantastic renovation of a 1970s office building in Amsterdam, the Walvis. And the renovation fitted their preferred architectural vocabulary perfectly. So they did like the perfect renovation, because what they prefer to do fitted with the building very good. And I see them doing other renovations where they come with that same vocabulary with a building that doesn't handle it, and then you get really bad projects. And the awareness also of your own preferences is of importance. So, what do you connect with? Where do you not connect? And so it's a lot of reflection also on yourself, on your own preferences. But you need to have a very open attitude towards history, because history is fundamental to the assignment of the 21st century. You cannot escape it anymore. We cannot escape it anymore. I have answers.
Maybe one more question from my side, and I give it to the public. What's the relation on the Amsterdam school? I have the impression that your brick buildings you do, they are very much rooted in this Amsterdam school tradition of modernism of the 30s. Are you very much inspired by that, or is it just?
No, it's like asking the fish for the water. If you practice in Amsterdam, then you're surrounded by bricks all day. So, for me, it was very interesting when we entered the profession in halfway 1990s. For us, it was a no-brainer to use bricks. Later on, I only kind of discovered, the kind of schisms and difficulties with brick, especially in the post-war period. There's a whole stories to that. But for us, brickwork was like a given. It was like the material available to work with. Mm-hmm. And I really like bricks as a material in its precision, if you like, and in its possibilities of expression. And with literary, the kind of very direct relation between material production, design, craftsmanship, all these kind of things. So in that sense, it's just a material that I enjoy very much, and I really enjoy working with. We did a lot of brick buildings. We continue to do a lot of brick buildings, but it's a material available, I would say. Mm. I couldn't do a plaster building, let me put it this way, because I don't come from a city with plaster buildings.
And you don't feel attracted to?
No, not yet, but you never know.
Oh, you never know. So, is there questions in the audience?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where you specialize on the. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Does it help?
No.
Okay. Okay. For the hotel brickwork project.
Yeah.
It feels like it's already pretty expensive, like doing the whole bottom work, and then you also put in this artwork. Let's call it that. Yeah. How do you? I see that a lot in, especially Dutch projects, which I feel like here in Germany or in German offices, it also always, or a lot of times, gets cut out. So after such a big impact with the bottom work, and how do you get the time and the loop in your projects to actually find time and money for this kind of artwork or special details, maybe?
You can also reverse it. They already spent so much money on the building that last piece of brickwork, that was like a non-issue for them. There is still, you have to realize, in the Netherlands there is still a lot of craftsmanship and people available to do brickwork. So it's still relatively cheap to do a brickwork wall in the Netherlands. I mean, to do an elaborated one like we did is like more expensive, but still it's relatively okay. And a contractor knows what he needs to do, and he can calculate it very much. There's very little risk for them. So in terms of its pricing, I think the building tradition and the building circumstance in Germany are different than in the Netherlands. And this kind of local situation is something to exploit. I mean, this marble facade I could do only in Switzerland with the marble available and the people that could handle that marble. In the Netherlands, such a marble facade is impossible. Nobody can pay for that one. But with brickwork, that works out actually quite easy. Funny enough, the kind of special bricks we had to get from Denmark. So bit weird, but still, you know, nevertheless. So it is possible to have them.
The owner gives you the freedom to kind of design things like this, or
Yeah, the owner just basically wanted quality. You know, these are clients that really demand a very high level of work, which we enjoy very much. Yeah, it also gives like possibilities. You know, it's not about that you earn very much on those buildings. So commercially, as an architectural practice, they're pretty much the same as social housing. In the end of the day, you make your hours and you earn a bit on it, but it's not. But they give you a lot of freedom to work with, you know, specially tailored materials, and that's the joy of the profession, I would say.
More questions? Yes.
So staying with the brick and also the hotel expansion, you showed these 5 different types of bricks.
Yeah.
Did you make them up yourself, especially for that brick facade, or were they like commercially available? No.
Tailor-made. We designed the brick facade first in its shape. Then we drew it up brick by brick, realizing we need like specially shaped bricks. That's why we needed to go to a special factory. We explained them what we want and what we need, and they could produce them. So, point. But we do that actually a lot with our projects. We very often use specially tailor-made bricks. We know the industry quite well, and we know who can provide what. So it's a matter of design. You know, you start with an idea of a building, with an object, with a texture, with kind of rounded corners, and then you really need to bring it down to how do you stack the bricks, what's the shape of the brick, and then in the end you reduce that to 5 different bricks, and with those 5 you redesign the facade almost again. So
did you learn that in architecture school, or is it like through long years of experience?
No, you learn that by doing.
Okay.
No, there's no education for that one.
More questions? Everybody satisfied?
Yeah.
So thank you very much again. It was really inspiring lecture. Very good.
Thank you very much.
I have to announce that next week we have another regionalist. We have Hans van der Heijden.
Oh, wow. He was on that picture.
Yes, exactly.
He was on the cover of that magazine.
now, when Hans van der Heijden has been here, then we had all the 4 of you here in our lecture series.
I realized. That's really nice.
So please be welcome next week, which will be another kind of completing lecture or sort of comparable story, I think. And I should also announce that we have the bar open tonight, so please be welcome to have a beer together with all of us. Thank you very much.